Have you ever noticed that the people who once admired everything about you eventually started reacting as if nothing you did mattered anymore? The same kindness that once made you unforgettable became expected. The same effort that once made them grateful became ordinary. The same presence they once longed for slowly became part of the background, like a sound that's been playing for so long the mind forgets it's even there. What hurts isn't that they suddenly became cruel. What hurts is that nothing dramatic ever happened. There was no betrayal anyone could point to. No obvious moment where everything fell apart. Respect didn't disappear overnight. It dissolved so slowly that by the time you realized something had changed, you couldn't even explain when it happened. You only knew that somewhere along the way, being deeply valued had quietly turned into being quietly assumed. And that transformation is one of the most painful experiences a person can go through because almost nobody talks about it. People talk about heartbreak. They talk about abandonment. They talk about rejection. But very few people talk about what it feels like to become invisible while standing in exactly the same place you've always been. The human mind has a strange relationship with permanence. It is designed to notice change far more than consistency. We instinctively pay attention to what appears, what disappears, what surprises us. But what remains constant slowly escapes our awareness. It's why you stop noticing the sound of the fan after a few minutes, or the feeling of your clothes against your skin. Your brain isn't trying to disrespect those things. It's simply trying to conserve attention. And sometimes, without anyone intending it, relationships begin to follow that same pattern. A person who was once exciting becomes familiar. Familiarity becomes routine. Routine becomes expectation. Before long, appreciation quietly loses its voice, not because the person became less valuable, but because their value stopped feeling new. That is where so many silent heartbreaks begin. Not in conflict, but in comfort. Comfort is beautiful until it becomes unconscious. There is a difference between feeling safe with someone and forgetting they are still choosing to be there. The first creates trust. The second creates assumption. Those two emotions feel almost identical at first, yet over time they lead to completely different destinations. One keeps seeing another person as someone worthy of gratitude. The other starts treating their presence as something that no longer requires attention because it seems permanent. The tragedy is that permanence is usually an illusion. Every relationship exists because two people continue choosing it, even when they stop noticing that choice. This is why effort often becomes invisible long before it disappears. Think about how quietly effort works. Nobody applauds consistency. They notice interruptions. If someone has always been patient, the first impatient moment becomes unforgettable. If someone has always been dependable, the one time they aren't available suddenly defines the conversation. Years of reliability disappear behind a single absence because consistency rarely announces itself. It simply blends into the background until it is interrupted. Suddenly people don't remember everything that was done. They remember the one thing that wasn't. That imbalance creates a strange loneliness. You begin giving more, not because anyone asked you to, but because you subconsciously feel something slipping away. You believe that if you become even kinder, even more available, even more understanding, you'll somehow restore the admiration that once existed naturally. But admiration rarely returns through increasing what has already become expected. Once something becomes normal, doubling it often changes nothing. The mind adjusts almost immediately. What once felt extraordinary becomes the new baseline. And that's the moment many people mistake for rejection. It isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's something quieter. Familiarity has changed perception. This is why people often find themselves asking questions that sound impossible to answer. What changed? Why do I suddenly feel unimportant? Why did everything feel different when nothing actually happened? Those questions are painful precisely because they don't have a single event attached to them. There is no obvious wound to point toward. Only a gradual emotional drift that neither person fully noticed while it was happening. The hardest part is that this drift often affects both people without either intending harm. One person slowly feels unseen. The other slowly stops noticing how much is being given. Neither wakes up planning to create distance. They simply adapt to the emotional climate around them. Human beings adapt to almost everything. We adapt to comfort. We adapt to beauty. We adapt to success. We even adapt to love. What once felt miraculous eventually begins to feel normal, not because it has lost its value, but because our perception has quietly adjusted around it. And perception is powerful. People don't always respond to reality itself. They respond to the version of reality their mind has become accustomed to seeing. If kindness becomes expected, it no longer creates the emotional impact it once did. If reliability becomes constant, it fades into the scenery. Not because it stopped existing, but because expectation has a way of hiding what it receives every day. This is why so many people eventually feel exhausted without understanding why. They aren't tired from loving someone. They're tired from watching their love become invisible. There is a unique kind of grief that comes from realizing your greatest strengths have become ordinary in someone else's eyes. You remember the beginning, when every conversation mattered. Every small gesture felt significant. Every shared moment carried emotional weight. It wasn't because either of you were different people. It was because attention naturally magnified everything that was still unfamiliar. Novelty gives ordinary moments extraordinary brightness. Familiarity slowly returns those moments to their ordinary size. That doesn't mean the relationship was fake. It means human attention changed. And attention quietly shapes emotion more than most people realize. This explains why people sometimes become haunted by memories that seem insignificant to everyone else. They remember a look that used to linger a little longer. A silence that once felt peaceful but now feels empty. A room that hasn't changed at all, yet somehow feels completely different. The environment stayed the same. The emotional meaning attached to it slowly evolved until even familiar places carried unfamiliar feelings. The cruel part is that this transformation almost never announces itself. Nobody says, "I appreciate you less now." Nobody decides, "Today I'll stop noticing everything they do." It happens beneath awareness, one ordinary day after another, until eventually one person begins carrying the emotional weight that two people used to share. That's why trying harder often feels strangely ineffective. When appreciation quietly fades into expectation, increasing effort doesn't always increase appreciation. Sometimes it simply raises the level of what is considered normal. The extraordinary becomes routine again, and the cycle quietly repeats itself. This is where many people begin questioning themselves instead of questioning the pattern. They wonder if they've become boring, less attractive, less interesting, less worthy. They search for flaws inside themselves because they can't find a visible explanation outside themselves. But sometimes the change isn't rooted in your value. It's rooted in how easily the human mind adapts to what it believes will always remain. And that realization is both heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. Absolutely. Here's a fresh part 2 that keeps the same cinematic, emotionally haunting tone while framing it as one deeply relatable human experience, not a universal law. Closeness can change how you're seen, part 2. Continue directly after part 1. Maybe the most painful realization isn't that someone changed. It's that you kept showing up the same way while the meaning of your presence slowly changed in their eyes. That is the part people struggle to explain. You remember the version of the relationship where small things mattered. A conversation could stay with you for days. A simple gesture could make the entire week feel different. There was a tension in the room. Not constant excitement, not perfection, just attention. And attention has a strange way of making people feel real. Then life becomes heavier. Responsibilities grow. Stress grows. Familiarity grows. Two people stop looking at each other with the same level of awareness they once had. Not because they stopped caring completely, but because the relationship becomes woven into everyday life. It moves from the front of the mind to the background of it. And for the person who still notices every shift, every silence, every missing spark, that transition can feel devastating. The confusing part is that nothing looks wrong from the outside. The relationship may still exist. The conversations may still happen. The routines may still continue. Yet something feels missing, and the absence is difficult to name. It's like walking through a familiar house and sensing that the air has changed even though every object remains in the same place. Many people carry guilt for feeling hurt by this. They tell themselves they should be grateful. They tell themselves they're asking for too much. They tell themselves that wanting to feel seen is childish. But the desire to be noticed by someone important to you is not a weakness. It's one of the most human desires that exists. We all want evidence that our presence still matters. And sometimes the deepest wound is not hostility. It's being treated as if your presence has become guaranteed. Think about how differently people handle things they fear losing. Attention becomes sharper. Gratitude becomes more visible. Effort becomes easier to notice. But when something feels permanent, the mind often relaxes its attention around it. Not out of cruelty. Out of habit. The tragedy is that human beings are rarely as permanent as they seem. That's why some relationships slowly drift into a painful imbalance. One person keeps remembering how meaningful things used to feel. The other person assumes the bond is strong enough to survive without being consciously nurtured. Neither person necessarily intends harm, but they begin living in different emotional realities. One is quietly grieving a change that hasn't been openly acknowledged. The other may not even realize a change is being grieved. This is where people often start doubting themselves. They replay conversations. They analyze memories. They search for a specific mistake that would make the pain easier to understand. Because if there was a clear mistake, there could be a clear explanation. But gradual emotional distance rarely leaves a clean timeline. It leaves a feeling. A feeling that you used to be looked at differently. A feeling that your effort used to land differently. A feeling that your presence used to create a response that no longer arrives. And because there is no dramatic event to point to, many people end up carrying the pain in silence. They feel guilty for being hurt by something they can't fully prove. They wonder if they're being too sensitive. They wonder if they're imagining it. They wonder if everyone eventually feels this way and simply stops talking about it. That silence is often the loneliest part. Not the change itself, but the feeling that you have no right to mourn it. Yet countless people have experienced some version of this, the slow realization that being loved and feeling seen are not always the same experience. A relationship can continue while attention quietly fades. Care can exist while curiosity disappears. Familiarity can grow while emotional visibility shrinks. These are difficult truths because they don't fit the simple stories people usually tell about relationships. And still, there is something strangely relieving about finally naming the experience. Not because it proves anyone was evil. Not because it means closeness always destroys respect. But because it tells the person who has been carrying this feeling in secret that they are not crazy for noticing the shift. Sometimes relationships change gradually. Sometimes people adapt to each other so completely that they stop expressing appreciation with the same intensity they once did. Sometimes one person feels that loss more deeply than the other. Sometimes both people feel it and don't know how to talk about it. Human connection is often more complicated than simple loyalty or betrayal. And maybe that is the haunting part. Not that love suddenly disappears, but that people can slowly stop noticing the very things that once felt extraordinary. They stop noticing the patience, the consistency, The quiet sacrifices. The steady presence. The way someone kept choosing them in 100 small ways that never became dramatic enough to be remembered. Until one day the person who was always there begins to wonder whether they were ever truly seen at all. And the cruel irony is that they probably were. Deeply. At least once. The memories were real. The admiration was real. The warmth was real. What changed was not necessarily the truth of the connection, but the level of conscious attention being brought to it. Familiarity dimmed the spotlight, and in the darkness it became difficult to tell whether the value had disappeared or merely stopped being acknowledged. For many people, that realization lands like a quiet ache rather than a dramatic revelation. They think back to all the moments they dismissed. The times they felt invisible but told themselves not to make a big deal of it. The times they missed being appreciated but felt guilty for wanting appreciation. The times they confused being needed with being seen. And perhaps that is why this experience stays with people for so long. Because it doesn't end with a single memory. It follows them into ordinary moments. Into rooms that used to feel warmer. Into conversations that used to feel lighter. Into the strange realization that a person can be physically present and emotionally harder to reach than they once were. But if there is any relief in finally talking about it, it may be this: feeling taken for granted does not automatically mean you were unworthy of appreciation. Sometimes it means a relationship drifted into unconsciousness. Sometimes it means attention faded while familiarity grew. Sometimes it means two people stopped actively seeing what had become familiar. And for the person who has been carrying this feeling alone, that distinction matters. Because the story is no longer, "I was never valuable." The story becomes something far more human and far more difficult. At some point, I stopped feeling seen by someone who once saw me clearly. And if that sentence hurts, it is probably because a part of you has been trying to say it for a very long time.